The title of this talk is Moving Online. It's based on a webinar which I gave for CITAR Deutschland. My name is Pete Sharma. As you can see from this slide, I do many different things in the language teaching arena. The aims of this talk are to identify the key differences between teaching in a classroom and teaching online, and also to explore the possibilities of using Zoom in online teaching. There are three parts to the talk. I'll start by differentiating classroom and online teaching, focusing on Zoom, and I'll finish off with some tips for getting started. Before we begin, it's worth reflecting on whether you yourself have ever taken a course online and what that experience was like. It's also worth mentioning that even though it's the first time for many teachers to actually move out of the classroom and move online, online teaching has in fact been around for many, many years and has its own body of theory and research. In the early days, people asked the question, how can we make online teaching as exciting as it is in the classroom? And it was Uschi Felix, the researcher, that first pointed out, perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps we're trying to compare apples and oranges. Maybe a better starting point is to view good and less good practice in teaching in the classroom, and similarly good online lessons and less good practice online. For many, many years I've studied the best of both worlds, which is how I like to see blended learning, although equally there are many challenges with blended learning, and it's sometimes been described as eclectic, a mishmash, the worst of both worlds. But one thing in blended learning is that people are always looking for what is the best that the teacher can offer in the classroom? What is the best that online offers, which is self-paced learning, learning anywhere at any time? There is a body of work that we study as classroom teachers, and one thing to say about online and distance is that there are a different set of books that outline good practice. So let's take a look at these differences, starting with teaching in the classroom. What do you do there? I mean, one thing I do is I move the furniture around constantly. I do a lot of non-tech activities, whereas in online teaching, you need to be familiar with things like netiquette, the rules of online communication, wearing a headset, using a webcam, and so on. But perhaps the good news is that many things that we do every day in the classroom transfer quite nicely into online, such as your role as a motivator, giving instructions, stating the lesson aims, having a warmer, and so on. There are many things that you do online which are similar, but you actually do them differently. For instance, working with your students in small groups, you can do that using breakout rooms. The usual rules of communication apply, but it's sometimes more difficult in an online environment, and maybe there's more need for signaling turn taking, for instance, and nominating speakers. This is a good model to see what online involves. This is classroom teaching, same time, same place, but online you could see it as either asynchronous, so for instance using a forum or using email, or synchronous, which could be a Zoom lesson. Synchronous teaching, of course, doesn't need to only use Zoom. There are many different platforms that people use nowadays. In fact, there are thousands and thousands of platforms which are used in language teaching and language learning. And also, thousands and thousands of tools as well that teachers use. So, having established somehow that there are similarities and differences, I'm going to move on now to this particular tool or platform that I'm using now, Zoom, and I'm actually recording this webinar or this talk in Zoom. Before going into Zoom, it's important to say that whatever you do is going to change depending on the size of your group. So if you're down here, starting off online could be relatively easy, just you and the student working together. And as the number increases, as it hits this figure 4, that might be the moment that you actually can decide whether to use breakout rooms, so having one pair here, one pair there, and then coming back together again. And the higher the number, the more that changes the way that you actually teach. So here are a wide range of Zoom features, which I'm going to just briefly talk you through now. So let's start off with the idea that you have 2 different ways of viewing your class. One is called speaker view, which is why Zoom is so popular in the business world. The speaker appears on the screen, and teachers often would select gallery view, such as here, where you can actually see all of your class, providing that you have a certain number of students. If it's very, very large, obviously that's slightly different. You can create polls very easily, which are very good to engage your learners with. And also you have a chat function, which is extremely useful. So you can communicate with the students, not only by speaking to them, but also by reinforcing what you say in the chat. And perhaps the most essential tool at the beginning is just the ability to share your screen. You can also work on a whiteboard, as your students can as well, and share your computer sound, which is absolutely critical for practicing listening online. You can send students links very easily to websites, and you can send them files through the chat. And many of the tools that you use in the classroom, such as Padlet or Mentimeter, whichever things that you're using, they can also be used in an online classroom. Very useful is the possibility of recording a lesson. So I'm using the record now, and also the chat that students use. You can save that chat and look back on it later. And perhaps one of the most popular features of all, the possibility of putting your students into different breakout rooms. So a lot of useful features on Zoom. And I'm going to conclude now by just sharing some key ideas, some tips, just to get you started as you transition to moving to teaching online. So the first tip is to ensure that you learn something online, take part in a webinar, or certainly experience what it's like being an online learner. And you need to do a personal skills audit. You can use this diagram, for instance. Think about your own level of knowledge, your skills level, and also at the same time, just how you feel about this new environment. And then from that audit, create your own personal development plan. So in other words, each context is different. So that plan will be personal to you. There's quite a lot of planning in where you're actually going to teach from. I'm actually teaching with a green screen behind me, so that means that I can choose a background, and as you can see, without a green screen here in this picture, quite some weird things can happen. You need to think about what you want as your display name for GDPR purposes. This is me talking to my daughter. She's changed her name, and also using a headset and lighting and so on. So there's quite a lot of planning involved. I'm going to now just run through this well-known model, the Tpack model. In this model, it assumes that you as a language teacher have content knowledge, so you know what a phrasal verb is, for example. You have pedagogical knowledge, you know how to teach phrasal verbs. So the technology, in a sense, is just there to support you in your teaching efforts. So one thing about teaching online, I think, is a really important shift. So if you're teaching in the classroom, the technology is just there to enhance what you're doing. But the minute that you move online, the technology is absolutely critical and it's essential to everything that you do. So it's not an optional extra. It's very useful to separate out getting practice in the technology and actually teaching. So you could have some parts of lessons at the beginning where you just practice playing on the interactive whiteboard, for instance, and actually get to grips with the technology. The next tip is keep it simple. But walk before you can run. Try to ignore these articles that say 101 things that you can do with. Just start teaching well. That's the critical thing. Start with good pedagogy rather than all the bells and whistles. And in online lessons, making it interactive, so that you always have this moment when students could type things in and answer questions and so on. You probably find that you need to prepare each stage quite carefully, perhaps more so than in the classroom, because there's less improvisation, so that you're ready to move on from stage to stage in your lesson plan. Okay, and time is different. Certainly, you need to aim for less. An hour in the classroom doesn't translate as an hour in an online environment. You can often do less in an online environment because there are other things that you're doing, such as dealing with technical issues sometimes, and so on. And perhaps my last and maybe even most important tip is just to be flexible. It's a changing world. The platforms change overnight, the technologies change, things crash around your ears from time to time, and you need to have a great, if you like, tolerance of uncertainty as an online teacher. So that's what we've been looking at in this talk, the differences between teaching in a classroom and teaching online, what things can be the same, what things are different. One particular tool, which is Zoom, and also I finished off sharing a few tips with you, which I hope you found useful. So thank you very much for listening.